This is a podcast from RadioMoLI, a digital radio station for Irish literature, broadcasting from MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, located on Dublin's St Stephen's Green. For more from RadioMoLI and the Museum of Literature Ireland, visit radio.moli.ie. Before we begin, I'd like to remind you that buying MoLI membership for yourself, your family or a friend is the best way to support the museum and its programming. Head over to moli.ie/membership to sign up. Thank you for listening.
UCD has a particular focus on equality, diversity and inclusion. So we've come together with MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland, in this project called Past, Present and Pride. It's a way for us to work with, to interview, to hear the voices of LGBTI writers, Irish writers and perhaps some international writers, a way to give voice to the LGBTI experience, to advance issues of diversity, inclusion and equality. I'm Paul Dalton. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work in UCD and I also work in St Vincent's Hospital in Allen Park. Today I have the great pleasure to meet and to introduce you to Mary Dorcey. Mary, a poet, novelist and activist. Mary worked in UCD for many years and subsequently in Trinity. So, Mary, a very warm welcome to Past, Present and Pride. This project we are doing in collaboration with Equality and Diversity in UCD and our colleagues and friends here in MoLI, the Museum of Literature Ireland. We're in Newman House, where UCD began its life in 1854. So welcome back to UCD.
Thank you.
Mary, a poet, a novelist, activist. You were born in Dublin in 1950. You've taught in UCD and subsequently in Trinity. And you've published 6 collections of poetry, a novel, and a collection of short stories. You are a founder member of the Irish Women United, Women for Radical Change, and the Movement for Sexual Liberation. Mary, of those 3 descriptions, poet, novelist, activist, which one captures you best now?
I don't think I can separate them. I often think about that, and I think, if I hadn't been a writer, I would have been an activist too. And if I hadn't been an activist, I would have been a writer. So they're really interwoven and they're very deep in me. I suppose the writing, the love of literature started before the love of politics. As a small child, I wasn't interested in politics, whereas I was passionate from the earliest years I can remember about literature.
Literature and activism, and their intersectionality. You've really lived that. You've lived that intersectionality, that kind of non-binary divide between activism and literature. Tell us more about that.
Well, it's a long story. I have to go right back to my childhood. I was the youngest of 5, and my father and mother both were great readers, and the house was always full of books. And I would be excited every evening waiting for my father to come home, because after tea, he would read to us. And he read to the 3 younger ones. So the older brother, the youngest of the 3 brothers, but the older than my sister and I, he would have been, I suppose, 10 or so. And I would have been maybe 3 or 4. And then the sister in the middle would have been 5. So he read for a book suitable for each of us. So I had nursery rhymes and so on, And then my brother had Dickens and Robert Louis Stevenson and all these wonderful writers, Jules Verne, And I can remember clearly my father's voice reading those stories. I can remember being terrified by Great Expectations. I've never read it since because I got such a fright, the opening Great Expectations. It's one book of Dickens I haven't been able to read since. So my father died when I was 7, and life changed very much. But the love of literature and the love of reading went on. And I actually couldn't read when he died. I didn't know how to read because I loved being read to so much I didn't see the point.
Yeah.
And then my mother just didn't have the time.
Yeah.
And that was the first time I was conscious of the difference between men and women's roles. She said, I can't, I'd love to, but I can't.
Yeah.
And then she tried to do it a little bit during tea. And I said, oh, you're not doing the voices right, because my father would do a whole drama.
Yeah.
And she didn't have time because she
Yeah.
was a woman and she was hurrying, And so, of course, I had to very quickly learn to read myself so that I could. And from the moment I began to read, I just embarked on world literature. I don't remember a stage. I went straight from sort of infancy into adolescence. I skipped a couple of stages.
And is it? Am I right in understanding this, that your brother, one of your brothers,
Yes.
went to the UK to study, and he brought books that were banned in Ireland home. I mean, the Kate O'Brien, the Edna O'Brien, the James Joyce. Is that?
Well, almost right, yes. I had 3 older brothers. My sister was next in line, and then 3 older brothers. And Donal was the middle one, Donal Dorcey. And he actually was, sadly, he is no longer with us, died a few years ago. But he worked on the Irish Times for years, so he was a journalist, very well known in Ireland. But as a young man, he was studying at UCD. And everything was banned in those days. That was the 60s. Everything was banned. I mean, the whole of English literature. A lot of people know that Joyce was banned and Oscar Wilde was banned. Everything was banned. And at that time, students, and they were mostly young men, all went to work in England in the summer, in factories. I think he went to a pea factory every year in some awful place, Hull or somewhere. And he'd come home. Other people came home probably with casefuls of porn or whatever, but he came home with world literature, and he just spill opened this case on his bed. So he was studying, the 3-year course, arts course. My father was a mathematician, and he had always wanted Donal to do maths, but Donal had this great love of literature, so went against it. But I would go up to his bedroom because it was the only place that was warm at that time, because he was allowed to have extra heat in his bedroom, because he was a serious student. So I'd lie on the bed, and to keep me quiet, he'd just hurl books at me. So from 10 to 13, I was sort of hothoused by him. I see that in retrospect. At the time, I just took it for granted. And he would literally throw books onto the bed and say, read page 10, read page 50. So I read Oscar Wilde, I read D.H. Lawrence, I read James Joyce, I read Steinbeck, all marked out by him. And then we discussed them afterwards.
Extraordinary. And I think for some people, Mary, the idea that Ireland of censorship would come almost as a surprise, that it, and as you say, it wasn't just James Joyce. What I'm wondering about growing up in that kind of an Ireland as a young girl, as a teenager. How did it shape you?
Well, it's very hard to describe to people who haven't lived through it, because, as you can probably imagine, knowing Ireland, there's always more than one reality going on. I remember when I was travelling a lot in the 80s, when I first began to publish, and I'd be going to countries, here, there and everywhere. And a lot of people would assume that you were either completely repressed in Ireland, and it was like a jail sentence to live there, or they would think you were just like the rest of Europe, rich and educated and liberal. And it was very, very difficult to describe the in-between world that we lived in. So growing up, I was conscious of that repression, of course, and I was conscious of the class distinctions, the poverty. There was such obvious poverty everywhere you went. And, the church going on a Sunday, you had to go to Mass on a Sunday. I remember my brother, the same brother who was studying at UCD, skipping Mass and going to the local pub and telling me, I was the only one who knew that's what he was doing. And then he told me, we all do that, all the guys do that. We just go across the road, we put a face in at the door and then we go to the pub. And I stopped going to Mass when I was, I think, 13 or something. I was very rebellious.
Did you? At 13?
Yes. And I was also, very, very passionate about it all. And I explained to my mother, I remember with tears in my eyes, because I'd become totally cynical about the Catholic Church, shocked by them. I'd been overeducated, you see, by the brother. I knew all about the persecutions and the terrible tyranny of the Catholic Church. And I said, I'm going to be a Protestant, So I'm still a Christian, I believe. I'll read the Bible, and I became an expert on the Bible briefly, and actually won there was a national religious competition in those days. And we all had to do a compulsory exam. Maybe it was, I don't know if it was just for convent schools. But anyway, I got first marks, and my mother was almost fainted when she heard. She couldn't understand how this could possibly have happened, to this.
And does it linger? Do that influence, those very strong influences at an early age, are they with you still?
Yes, it formed my radicalism. I was conscious always, as I am to this day. It's very hard for me to describe one or other reality, because for me there's always dark and light present. So I think could say I lived in a paradise until my father's death. And then things changed hugely. And that was my first experience of complete change, that I learned, I think, that the worst can happen. I think that's what I learned at an early age. And in some ways then, there were always moments with my friends I'd be cut off from them because they were more childish than me. They had a naivety. They didn't know the worst could happen.
Yeah.
They were still living in that happy place where if your parents said everything's going to be all right, it would be all right.
Yeah.
But I had been told my father would be all right, and he wasn't,
Yeah.
So certainly that marked me.
Yeah.
But I was having such a wonderful life. I had such fun at school. I had wonderful friends.
Yeah.
Immediately after my father's death, I moved from kindergarten to this, secondary primary school.
Yeah.
And had wonderful friends there. And this is crucial to always, I talk about this. We lived right beside the sea. And it was still this was Dalkey, South County Dublin, but it was a wild place in those days. And there was an old-style fishing community who could have been in Connemara,
Right.
Men in long black coats with caps. And they owned a rowing boat, a big, big skiff, that would be about 17 foot long. And they went out every morning at 6 to haul the pots, They would put them down in the evening, then collect them in the morning. And they always needed what they called a boy, to help them. They would do the rowing. And my brothers used to do that as children, and then I did it. And I learned to be a very, very good oars person. And so we had this wildness in the nature around us, and the atmosphere of a harbour is always a bit wild. There were always tough characters around there. So you saw every side of life. And the physicality of rowing and swimming every day, I just loved. Was just passionate about nature.
And so at 7 to lose your dad and to know that actually the worst thing can happen.
Yes.
The worst thing
Yes.
did happen. The worst
Yes.
thing did happen.
Yes.
Such a formative experience, and shaping your radicalism.
Yes.
And your interaction. You're growing up in a very, very Catholic world, and
Yes.
being very shaped by that.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, extraordinary.
Well, I got involved in politics very early. I can't really say where the social conscience came from, although two of my brothers, I suppose, had it to some extent too. And my mother, while she was never an activist, my grandmother was a tremendous activist. And my mother would always say, Granny will never be dead while you're alive. Granny was a great Republican.
What was she interested? What was Granny interested in? What was Granny interested in? What was she?
Well, she was a Republican, you see.
Yeah.
And and very active. And they grew up in Portlaoise, and Granny left Portlaoise in 1916 to come down to Dublin. She said she was going shopping, at Easter. And people didn't realise for a long time. Oh, yes, she was hiding. She was in Inina Heron and knew all the great names of the time, They were all her friends. Because it was a very small world. So she was a feminist and a Republican. And as I was always reminded, Republican as in the sense of Catholic, Protestant and dissenter. It was Wolfe Tone's Republicanism. So it wasn't the narrow Catholic first Republicanism, She was a very broad-minded person, and she talked about politics all her life. And she was absolutely crazy about the theatre. I knew all the figures of the day. From the time my mother was 15, they moved to Baggot Street because Granny wanted to be part of the action, and she opened a shop there. And she, in her old age, she used to hold forth, and that really was what she did in the Shelburne Hotel. I thought that was a brilliant idea, Instead of staying at home waiting for people to come in, she'd go into the Shelburne, and everybody knew that's where you met Mrs. Kiersey, if you wanted to see her. And I used to mitch from school at that stage and drop in to see Granny, and she didn't care at all if I was still in my school uniform. She thought, here's the chance to chat to Mary, So she was an influence.
And negotiating or finding your way in that kind of wider culture, finding your way, your sexual identity, realizing that you were lesbian in that kind of a world. Talk to me a little bit about that.
Well, I'd have to place my mother a little in it because, as I say, she inherited that notion of Catholic, Protestant and dissenter. So she was a person of deep faith. And of course, we were, absolutely normal church-going Catholics when I was growing up. And my mother didn't know anything about, certainly not lesbianism. Although I remember her saying to me, there were quite a few women I knew, elderly women who lived in couples, and they always pretended they were sisters. But nobody seemed quite convinced of that. And I remember asking my mother about a particular couple who were friends of hers. And I remember her saying it struck me, and I didn't know why it struck me, because I would only have been 9 or so. And she said, well, Mary, not every woman likes to marry. There are some women who aren't suited to marriage, and they prefer to live with a companion. I was thinking, that's very interesting. And what struck me, I think, at that time was just the notion of anything that was different. I was always looking for the unconventional. So my mother, while being extremely respectable, it's a difficult mix to describe. She was also extremely broad-minded. She lived in a particular way, but she was extremely unusual in that she could allow other people to be completely different. And she really believed in freedom of conscience. But nevertheless, when I came out as gay, I thought, this is going one step too far.
How old were you?
I think I was 23.
Yeah.
Have to put it in perspective because, of course, I'd been in love with a girl at school, as we've all been. But when I was a teenager, I thought I was bisexual. I was quite sure of that. And that was even more confusing because, where was I going to find bisexuals? And I don't think we even had the words for it. No, we wouldn't have had the words for it. And when I was 15, 16, I met a charming French man who's 4, 5 years older than me, and fell in love with him. And I was with him for 7 years, going back and forth. I studied in France then when I was 20, and we'd break up and get together again, and break up and get together. And the reason we broke up was because I was always conscious that there was something else, there was something missing, And I've thought about this a great deal because he was a lovely person. And I had another male partner too, who I still know very well, a really, really lovely guy. And I could have lived with either of them. And Francois, the French guy, certainly wanted to marry me and constantly asked. And my mother adored him, and everybody thought, Mary's so lucky now, she's fallen on her feet, and she never makes any effort, and here she is now with the perfect young man. And they had such expectations for me, and I went to study, as I said, in Paris Diderot University in Paris, and he was already a lecturer at that stage. And everybody thought, that's Mary settled now, and she'll calm down, because Paris will be a big enough stage for her. And after a year or 18 months, I came back again. And it was the first time my mother was really angry with me. She was really disappointed. And she said, oh, Mary, what are we going to do with you now? If this didn't work, what is going to please you? And I was trying to explain what was wrong about it for me. And she said, but whatever you do, there'll be difficulties. Everything in life has difficulties. And if you're not able to accept the difficulties, because I had this purist notion. Anyway, I think a large part of it was that I couldn't adapt. I couldn't accept what was offered to me as the female role at that time, as wife and mother. And because I knew I was really attracted to my own sex, I was extremely conscious that I could fall in love with a woman. I could marry Francois and have children and be very happy up to a point. And then I had this fear that someday, and of course I was right, someday a woman would walk round the corner and I'd fall madly in love with her. And I was afraid I'd leave my children. And I think, I've told other women this, I've told women who have left their children, who have fallen in love with a woman. And they say, how could you have known that at that age?
Yeah.
And why would it have mattered so much?
Yeah.
And I think it was probably because I'd experienced what it was to lose a parent, that I just felt I could never do that.
Okay.
I could never do that.
Okay.
And at the same time, I couldn't promise that it wouldn't happen, you see.
Okay.
So I thought, I can't promise myself to Francois and then, run out. And I can't be trapped.
Yeah. And Mary, there were two pieces there. There was the love, the attraction to women.
Yes.
And a not wanting to fall into roles that were expected of women at the time.
Yes.
Both going on there for you. Yeah. I came across a report of a headline that said, I think it was at a debate in UCD in 1970, and it said, a self-confessed lesbian denounces heterosexuality.
Yes, that brought the house down.
Tell me about the background.
I came home from France, you see, sort of in disgrace, and thinking, well, I have to do something to justify being here. And Ireland was still in the dark ages. And having lived in France and having been in other countries, I'd already travelled, I'd already lived in England for a short stage. And I thought, I can't possibly put up with this place. Somebody has to shake it up, And I thought, where can I find some radicals? There must be. And the only name I had as a person who was even radical, never mind feminist or gay, I had no idea she was gay, was Nell McCafferty, because I had read her pieces in the Irish Times while I was abroad. So I knew that she was part of the Women's Liberation Group. And I went to their first meeting. My first meeting. They had been active for a year or two. And I was so disappointed because they were actually discussing marriage on the night that I got there. For some reason, they were discussing the ins and outs of marriage. And I remember Nell saying some extraordinary, God knows why, saying, wouldn't we all love the certificate? Wouldn't we all love to be married? Wouldn't we all love to walk up the aisle? And I thought, oh my God, is this women's liberation? So I thought, I have to find gay people somehow. They have to exist. And I've told this story so often, it sounds like something I've just made up, but it actually did happen this way. I was walking up Grafton Street with my girlfriend, Irene Brady, who lives in Paris and is still a really close friend of mine. And we saw on a poster, Sexual Liberation Movement meets tonight, Trinity. And she had never, nobody had ever seen the word sexual written in public in Ireland in large letters. And I said, we're going. And we had about half an hour before it started. And I just knew, this is it. This is going to change my life. I didn't know what it was. Oh, I should have said that just before I left Paris, I did meet, one of my lecturers was gay, and I discovered it just at the end.
Right.
And she brought me to a big, beautiful, beautiful spectacle, as they used to call them in France. A light show, which was something that didn't happen in Ireland.
Yeah.
It was some marvellous building somewhere on the left bank. And I walked into this room and I thought, these are the most beautiful people I've ever seen. Who are these people, And she said, a lot of them are gay and the others are all artists. This is my world. I have to find these people somehow. Instantly, I thought, this is me. And anyway, so I see this poster and I say to Irene, we're going. And I went to the little room in Trinity, above the stairs as you go in. And here were 6 wonderful people, 2 of them leaping around on a table, I remember, 2 wonderful gay men with a lot of makeup on, Hugo McManus, who is still a friend, living in Milan for many, many years. And we started almost immediately. We just got down together and they said, you know, what are you? You know, and I said, I don't know what to call myself. I think I'm probably bisexual. And they said, okay, we'll put you down as that, you know. They needed a bisexual.
Yeah. And denouncing heterosexuality. Tell me about the fallout reported in the paper.
Yes.
You know, the self-declared lesbian.
Well, between announcing myself as bisexual to the group, then I decided I fell in love with a beautiful French woman in the meantime. And I had been going to the Women's Liberation meetings. So I think it was the first Women's Week of UCD, the first time there had been a Women's Week festival, you know, that went on for 5 days with lots of discussion and conferences. And there was an English woman who was to speak, and she got ill at the last minute, and there was nobody to fill in, and somebody said, would you do it, Mary? And I had been a debater at school, and, you know, I knew I could get through a speech all right. And I thought, well, this is my chance, you know, to just shake the place up a bit. And I didn't think I was going to be staying in Ireland. I thought this was, you know, a short-term thing. And I was in love with my lovely French girl, and she was sitting in front of me in the front row, you know, and certainly had to impress her. So there was a young man with me, Fergus Martin, who is an artist and is now in Easthona too with me. And he was obviously a young gay activist. And I remember him sitting in his beautiful little dungarees looking so innocent. And there was a well-known psychologist sitting who was sort of introducing us. And I think she had no idea that we were gay. She just took it for granted, you know, because people thought, you know, gay people had hordes. They really did. So I think she was astonished when we stood up and introduced ourselves as gay. But I decided to just go for it, you know. And I wasn't going to make any apologies, you know. I was going to change these people. It was their problem. If they couldn't see how beautiful we were, that was their problem. So I do remember saying that, of course, very influenced by feminism in the States, which we were all reading then, Kate Millett and so on. And if feminism is the theory, lesbianism is the practice. So that was one of the lines, you know. And I did say that heterosexuality, you know, was sadomasochism, you know, and elaborated on the point. So the place was packed. It was a room about twice the size, and it was filling up as I was speaking, and the shouting was starting within minutes of my standing up. And I really hadn't foreseen that the degree of aggression. I had never faced that before. And it actually wound me up. I was enjoying it because it was like a football match, you know? And I didn't think of it as having consequences. That was just the arena for that night.
Yeah. And the fallout at home, at getting that kind of attention, those kind of headlines, what?
Well, it was immense because, you know, I had done it all on impulse and I hadn't prepared my mother. And I had said to the journalist who was sitting in the front row, I didn't know there would be journalists, there weren't usually. And she said, can I cover this? And I said, well, yes. I said, but don't use my second name because we're actually the only ones in the country, Dorcey. It's extremely unusual. There aren't any other Dorceys in Ireland. And she said, oh, no, I won't. So probably she didn't have the last say, you know how it is, the sub-editor changes it. So the very next day, as you've probably heard, there was a banner headline on the front page of the Irish Times, just as you said, self-confessed lesbian denounces heterosexuality as sadomasochism, see page 7. And I remember sitting with my girlfriend at the time and turning the page and thinking, oh my God, you know, how will we go home to my mother? My mother, the widow, living alone, surrounded by very respectable, you know, conservative neighbours. So it was one of the worst times of my life that I went out. I was already living away from home, obviously, but because my mother lived alone and we were tremendously close, she was wonderful. We were already wonderful companions, you know, intellectual companions. We always talked about books and ideas and politics. And she welcomed all my friends to the house and was tremendously generous. But anyway, we went out to see her for Sunday lunch. And she was standing at the sink. And I hadn't really seen her cry since the first few years after my father's death. And the tears were just flowing down her face. And she couldn't speak. I had never seen her. She was a very strong woman, very courageous, and had been through a lot of trouble in her life. She couldn't speak. She couldn't look at me. She couldn't speak. And the tears just kept flowing. And she went on making the dinner, and we sat down for Sunday lunch, and the tears flowed all through the meal. And she didn't speak. We stayed then because we thought we can't leave her on her own. She literally couldn't speak. It was astonishing. And I kept talking, but she didn't.
Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know if she phoned my sister or if my sister was coming anyway. My sister was living in London, and she was cool, sophisticated. She was older than me, and she knew some gay people in London, you know. So she came over and she told me afterwards, she said, listen, everybody knows she's gay, Mom. Sure, everybody knows it just because you're such an old fuddy-duddy, you know.
Yeah.
You've got to get with the programme.
Yeah.
So that was a helpful approach. And we drove the sister to the airport after 2 days. And on our way back, my mother still couldn't speak. And I said, Mom, I'm so sorry you found out this way. You know, I'm really sorry I hurt you. And then we began to talk.
Oh.
And from the moment onwards, then, we began this debate, you know.
Right.
It continued for the rest of our lives. That she said, in her very quite noble way, she said, well, you can't expect me to understand. Mary is very new to me, and I don't have, you know, the information to understand, but we'll have to talk about it.
Wow, extraordinary.
We began a wonderful dialogue.
Extraordinary. Mary, was there room? So I'm thinking of the kind of 70s, 80s. I'm thinking about the women's movement. I'm thinking about our own membership of what has become the EU. All of those changes that were taking place. Where were lesbian women? Was there room for lesbian women in that? What happened to them in all of that?
Oh, well, of course, the EU began to change things for us. And how I think about it is that the EU forced new legislation on us, but the women's movement and the gay movement prepared the ground. We did the education, we did the consciousness raising that made it possible for Irish people to accept those big legislative changes, you know?
Yeah.
And the two worked together.
Yeah.
And without that, I don't think Ireland could have accepted the EU in the way that we did, you know?
Yeah.
And I think it's a factor of Irish society, isn't it? That it's one of the good things about us, that because we're so small, people get educated very quickly. You know, the news goes round.
Yeah.
News travels fast.
Yeah.
And the early women's movement and the early gay movement, we went around the country from the start, talking in conferences and talking in small groups, and most of the time being thrown out and people throwing things at us. But, you know, the word did spread very quickly, and people began to debate it very quickly, and people began to be... I don't think we were asked onto television until much later. Not Irish people. You know, there were the two lesbian nuns on the Late Late, and, you know, it was okay for a foreigner to do it, just about.
Lesbian nuns on the Late Late in the mid-80s? Early mid-80s. And there was uproar, wasn't there?
Absolutely, yes. But I know that they said they were astonished to find that the next day they walked, you know, up and down Grafton Street, and people came flocking to them, shaking their hand and thanking them and congratulating them. So there's always that double thing in Ireland, isn't there? Because so many people, you know, even if they didn't have a gay bone in their body, everybody had a secret. Everybody had been forced into secrecy and guilt about something. And that's really what we represented for them. And all my life, that has happened to me too, since, you know, that first night at UCD. People come up to me continually and say, thank you for speaking out.
Yeah.
Because that gave me the courage to speak out about whatever it was.
Yeah. And going kind of back to your mum a little bit. I mean, a lot of your work, at least to my ear, to my hearing, is about the roles that women occupy, play, are sometimes forced to play. And how they transcend some of those roles.
Yes.
And you're not afraid to say things. You're not afraid to share those secrets. In a way, really, that's terribly, I think, very brave. And when I read you, And I think of the context, I think of the 70s, 80s, and early 90s. And the bravery required to say some of those things out loud really strikes me.
Well, it was the dark ages. It's hard to overemphasize that. It was, the 50s that I grew up in was so grim. Poor, very little food, places in Ireland had no electricity or even running water. We used to visit friends in Wicklow who pumped their water, they didn't, and that was just down the road, so to speak. And they're just simply, unless you were a Protestant, and even then, if you were a Protestant, you had to be ultra respectable. We had a lot of Protestant friends. And no Catholic could afford not to go to Mass, not to be seen to go to Mass. So you really can't overemphasize the level of repression. And that was we were still in the grip of that in the 70s.
Yeah.
And there was such a strong right-wing movement, when we had protest marches and any kind of public meetings, we had eggs thrown at us and roaring and shouting. We were, hit over the head. We had stones thrown at us. We had, when we, as the women's movement used to go, as you know, to the 40-foot, that was one of our campaigns that we all enjoyed. And we were literally stoned. There were gangs of guys waiting for us every time. And for some reason, they loved throwing flour at us. That was one of the things. Flour. They'd have bags, big bags of flowers. And they seemed to think this was tremendously terrifying, And they would scream abuse at us. And we would just charge in and throw ourselves into the water. And their main problem was that they had to cover up then, because as you know, there was nude bathing there. And they thought, now we're going to have to cover up. So that extreme radical, the extreme right-wing conservative atmosphere was omnipresent. So I should say that none of this would have been possible for me if I hadn't been part of a movement. If I had been an isolated gay person, and if I hadn't had a lover, I don't think I would have done any of this.
What might have happened?
I don't know, but from the moment I fell in love, I thought, I'm not going to lie about this. I was so proud of her. I was so happy. I was so thrilled. There was no way in the world I was going to keep my head down and, hide this person. I would honestly have rather died. I'm quite happy to be shot rather than do that. It's not in my nature. And I didn't care what anybody thought, this is how I feel and this is the person I love. And from the beginning, that was our attitude. And she was beautiful and extrovert and lovely personality. And people just, couldn't see us in any way as perverted. They just didn't, all the names just rolled away from them because it just obviously didn't fit.
Can I ask you to read a poem?
Yes.
and maybe one that gets to some of what we're talking about right now. The "Come quietly, the neighbours might hear." Do you have that handy?
I do. I have it.
Would
somewhere.
You mind reading that for us?
Might take me a minute. To get hold of it. Well, yes, that really describes the grim side of Irish life in that period. And I came up to Dublin. I had been living in Kerry. I lived in Kerry for 8 years, and I ran it. Well, I shouldn't say I ran it. This lovely French lover, Garel Dupredal, who was a chef, brilliant chef. She'd grown up, between Ireland and Paris, and her grandmother ran the Hotel du Nord in Paris. So she literally learned to cook at her grandmother's knee. And then we had lived in America together. We lived in Boston and in Maine and in New York. And she cooked in the restaurants all along the East Coast, did her further training there. So that was always her dream. And we went to Kerry, and we had been intending to stay there just a winter. I went down to write, and I wanted to be on my own, but she followed me, of course. And then the summer came on, and she was to go to France that summer. Her mother had a place in the south of France, and she was going to go there and open a restaurant in the south of France. But at the last minute it fell through. She couldn't get the money for it or something. And to comfort her, she was devastated. And to comfort her, I brought her into Dingle, and I said, look, there's bound to be somewhere. There were already 2 famous restaurants in Dingle, and it was just beginning to grow, beginning to become the Kinsale of Kerry, And I said, we surely can find one here. So anyway, we did, and we stayed, and she was there for 10 years, I was there for 8. So I came up one winter to spend the winter in Dublin, and I remember being on, I think it's Herbert Street, just off Bagot Street, and it was grim in the way that flats were then in the old Georgian houses, and it happened to be full of elderly women who would make their way up very slowly up the stairs, and they all listened to the news at the same time. All their televisions would be on. You'd hear the bong bong of the Angelus, and then the awful bad news. And as it happened in the way that Ireland, typically mixed Ireland, you know, my front step for some reason was where all the prostitutes used to meet too, and they would be having clients at 9 o'clock in the morning, and you would have to push past, you know, the girls to get out to do your shopping at 9 o'clock in the morning. So the two worlds were always in collision. And there would be, as you know, this litany of bad news with the sort of black emotions that so many Irish people have and they love. I call it the sacred news because so many people have to watch the 6 o'clock news, you know. And they seem to have this ghoulish love. So my lover would come to visit me there, and it's Come Quietly or the Neighbours Will Hear. It's a very long poem, so I'll just begin
even some of it.
Have you ever made love with the TV on, to spare the neighbours, landlady, lord, the embarrassment, the joy undisguised of two people, especially women? Imagine the uproar coming together. Come quietly or the neighbours will hear. That year was the worst, an aching winter of it, small mines and towns, rented rooms and narrow beds, walled in by other people's decencies. And at every sitting down to table, broadcast at breakfast, dinner and tea, the daily ration of obscenity. Have you ever made love with the TV on? Come quietly or the neighbours will hear.
Beautiful.
So that
Thank
does
you.
capture, it explains also the sort of passionate rebellion I had, because it was a country of horrors. There was so much suffering and so much sin, you know, and so much shame and secrecy. And in the women's movement, we discovered it long before others, because people came to us right from the beginning, and we knew about child abuse before other people did, and we knew about priests sleeping with their housekeepers and having children and sending them into orphanages, and we knew about people brought up in orphanages who'd had to give up their children. We knew all these tragic stories. Women would come every week. This was Irish Women United, and they would come to the Sunday meeting, and they would sit in the back of the room sobbing. And one after another would tell her story, thinking she was the only one in the country. And then the others, you know, would say, that's my story.
You, in addressing those issues, you there's a tenacity in your voice, in your writing, in your writing voice. But I've also, there's an emotional tenacity, an emotional directness that I've been really taken by in reading your work over the last number of weeks, in particular, preparing for today. And there's a poem, Parting. I hope I have it right.
Yes, I'm sure you
Parting.
do.
that really stopped me in my tracks. And I'm told that I should never read a poet's poems to them, but if you don't mind, can I read a couple?
Oh, this is the one for my mother.
Yeah. So
yes, it's an unusual poem, and it is actually, unlike many poems, it's directly from experience. Usually they're a combination of, you know, imaginative experience, sometimes other people's. You're not always writing about yourself. You can write in the first person and use it as a device, you know, to tell somebody else's story. But in this case, this is how it happened, parting. Do
you mind if I read a little bit of that?
No, I'd love it.
Badly,
please.
I'm sure.
Please,
I'll read it badly.
Please do.
and so this is your mom. This is about your mom, the woman we've spoken quite a bit about.
Yes, and she's 93.
She's 93. I had never found you not ready to talk. So I took the family photographs down from the shelf behind you where I had set them 12 months before. And I said aloud all the names of your children, one by one, coming last to my own. The youngest, I said. You thought that was funny. You smiled without moving your lips. I told you where each one was living, which one might get here in time and which one might not. You listened without the least show of surprise. Then I said the names of your mother, your father, your 6 dead siblings. They are expecting you. I've sent word. They will have everything ready. You smiled. I asked if you were thirsty, and you said yes. But when I held the plastic beaker to your mouth, the juice ran everywhere, staining the front of your new bed jacket. We need more practice at this, I said. We'd better start quickly then, you replied.
Thank you. I've never heard somebody else read it.
To your mum in the last weeks of her life?
It was her last day. It was actually the last day. I was living out of Dublin, and she, of course, her memory was fading, for many years, and I was the main carer, not the only one. My sister was living abroad, and 2 of my brothers. And so it was a heavy burden in sense of time commitment and so on. But because we were so close and we had really a remarkable way of communicating, I think even from childhood but we'd had to develop it because she had such a difficult journey. I should have said that when I came out, she, immediately after that report in the Irish Times, she had vile abuse, people bringing her up, and actual death threats and appalling insult and abuse.
She had death threats?
Oh, yes. And at least half the town turned their back on her. And she didn't tell me this for a long time. People just stopped talking to her. And the family, their cousins and aunts, uncles and aunts who didn't speak to her or didn't talk about me again for years. A favourite aunt who was also her favourite sister. And she told me years later that aunt never mentioned my name again. So that was a tremendous burden for her to carry. And she had a choice, I think, either to reject me or to accept me and change with me. And we kind of agreed to do that together. And she had, remarkable courage, and she had a tremendous pride. And she had a way when she was going through something very difficult of just lifting her head. She'd bow down at first, you'd see the sorrow, and then she'd lift her head and she'd say, right, we're going to handle this, So she was tremendously welcoming of all my friends and always had my partners to the house, and the neighbours didn't really approve of that. It was years before she had a neighbour who thought I was a good idea, and who thought that my books were something to be proud of. So anyway, by the time she was in her old age, we moved into a new stage of remarkable communication. And as she was losing her memory, I became her memory. And we had this sort of game we'd play where I'd prompt her, I'd ring her, and she'd say, hello, and she'd say, it's very kind of you to ring, and who is this? Do you mind my asking who this is, And I'd say, do you want the facts about you, Mom? And she'd say, oh, that would be very helpful. And I'd go through the facts, from her early days and her own family and then her children. And at the end of it all, she'd say, oh, thank you so much, Mary, that's wonderful. But on one wonderful occasion, I remember her saying, thank you so much for telling me all this. And would you mind telling me, how is this? So we moved, in and out of that kind of rationality. She could be completely rational, and some things she never forgot, and then other things would be gone completely. So by the time she was in the nursing home, I suppose half of her intelligence was gone. but she could still connect at a very deep level, and she knew she was dying. There was no doubt about that. Anyway, I was in Kilkenny, and I used to ring twice a day, and I rang that morning. It was Saturday morning, and I spoke to the matron, and she said, oh, she's in great form, she's going nowhere, she's just a little bit tired, she's a little bit of a cold. And she said, but the doctor was in this morning to see her. I called the doctor, and I said, well, I'll just bring the doctor myself, I think. And I spoke to the doctor, and it was a bank holiday weekend, and she said, oh, she's perfect, Mary. I'll come back in on Tuesday. And she said, she's in very good form. It's nothing more than a cold. And she is, as always, smiling, she said. And I put down the phone, and I thought, she's not. She's dying. I don't know how I knew that. And my partner was to come down that weekend, and I just phoned her and said, don't come, I'm driving up to Dublin. And I got into the phone, straight into the phone, into the car, and drove up to Dublin. It was, 2.5-hour journey, and raced to the nursing home, and opened the door. And my mother was sitting up like a queen, beautifully dressed and with her hair swept back, looking perfect. And I looked at her and knew she was dying. I don't know how I knew. And I thought, why does nobody else know she's dying? It's perfectly obvious she's dying. And the only change was a bruising under her face, which I know actually is, one of the signs of heart failure. The blood isn't getting to the head anymore. And she was sitting, after a few minutes, I realised she was looking as if she was holding something very fragile in her hand, and she had to keep absolutely still, maybe balancing something like cut glass, on her head, because she looked as if she couldn't afford to move. And it was her own life she was balancing. Yeah. And she must have felt the tide of death rising in her, but she was smiling and totally unafraid. Yeah. And she had a beautiful air of expectancy. And she was always a little bit nervous. She was a Cancer person, astrology, and loved her home. And you had to dig her out of her home. But she did like to go and visit other people, and she liked to travel. But there was always a bit of nervousness when the suitcases were packed. She'd be a little bit of flutter, afraid of missing the plane, that kind of thing. And, oh, now are we late, And that's how she was. Yeah. It was that little nervousness, but expectation.
Yeah. And in fact, I think you use that line that she never liked leaving, or she never liked departures.
Yes.
And maybe that's in the parting too.
Yes.
The language, the words that you use, the words that poetry you use in your poetry, allows you to say things that maybe are hard to hear. Some people would find hard to hear.
Yes, yes.
And there's a precision in your words that I was reminded a little bit of the poet David White, who trained as a scientist, as a biologist, and he said that he left science for poetry because the language of science wasn't precise enough.
Oh, that's lovely. That's lovely. Yeah.
But I hear that in the language that you use about things that are hard for us to talk about.
Yes, that is the struggle for me when I'm writing. It is the most challenging part, and I had an example of that just the other day, because a friend of mine, husband died very suddenly. And I was so moved by her situation, because she's at the moment in poor health herself. And I sat down to write to her, and instead I wrote a poem. And it took 2 days. And it was about their relationship, to celebrate their love. And I was trying to tell somebody else about it, the journey. And it is that you have to go right into that emotion yourself to say something truthful. You have to empathize totally, as if it were happening to you. Or this is how I experience it. And it isn't until you get really to the depth of the experience that you can find, the words find themselves. And one of my examples is that, when somebody is on the news and they'll be giving an interview about something very hard that's happened to them, and they're quite calm and their voice is quite smooth, and then the interviewer says something that isn't particularly harsh, but suddenly they catch, there's a catch in the voice, and tears will flow down their face because one word has pierced through to the heart. One word holds all the pain. And very often when you're trying to write about suffering, you have to find what that word is. And it does, it is a strange kind of alchemy, because it does carry the pain to other people.
And in a world where there is a tendency towards fundamentalism, towards kind of dichotomized views of right and wrong, and fundamentalism, your words or poetry is an antidote. In some ways, I think, and maybe that's where it kind of fits or speaks to issues of equality, diversity, and inclusion, because it rests somewhere in the middle, in the non-binary. Does that make any sense?
It does, yes, because to go back to the past again, when I was in the height of, or the depths of my activism, and, just a very small group of us, and we maybe 10 who could take the risk of being, open about our position, even about contraception or abortion, never mind lesbian or gay rights, But we would go to small, town halls and small meetings, and half the time either nobody came or they just hurled abuse at us and we had to leave. But very quickly, when I had begun to write, I had always written, I should say I've always written poetry and always written stories, but I wasn't thinking of publishing until the 70s. And occasionally I would read a poem in one of these groups. And I found very quickly that it just stopped the abuse. People who had come to me all furious, and had the eggs ready in their basket, would just stop and look really, really puzzled, and often would have tears in their eyes and would come up afterwards and say, I didn't want to like you, I didn't expect to agree with you, and don't think I do agree with you. I don't agree with you. I think that's criminal what you're doing. But what you said there about, and I saw it pierced. It got through to them.
Yeah. And Mary, I think that's so important. And again, maybe it was, I can't remember who said it, but that poetry is language that we have no defenses against. It gets kind of, it gets behind our defenses.
Yes.
And particularly pertinent when it comes to issues that you've fought for all of your life, for equality and justice and diversity. Language, the poetry being the kind of, I want to say the back door, and I don't mean it that way, but the way in.
Yes, if you get it right, and you get a poem right, that's what it can do.
Yeah.
And as I say, I did learn that, and not that activism isn't just as important as ever, but it does tend to push people into their own side. People rarely change, certainly not at a meeting or a one-to-one. People do very often become even more entrenched, as you know yourself, in whatever their viewpoint is. Whereas if they listen to poetry, it does reach the heart, and it exposes them. It opens up something that they can't resist.
Yeah. I think you've said elsewhere that poetry is a political act.
Yes, I might well have said that. And my partner, Ursula Halligan, who's very involved in a journalist and very involved in campaigning at the moment for reform in the Catholic Church. She's a very passionate feminist. And she has discovered that too, that when she uses poetry, people can hear in a way that they mightn't otherwise. She's discovered that very often. That too reaches even very conservative people who have closed minds.
It can open hearts, changing hearts and minds.
Yes.
And is such an antidote to our sometimes our public discourse that's so dichotomized.
Yes.
That's so binary.
Yes.
And and through poetry we can find ourselves, we find that we can, as you say, if it's done well, we can find the common ground, the middle ground, the middle way.
Yeah.
Mary, it's been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you this morning. From our colleagues in UCD in equality, diversity and inclusion, and from our colleagues and friends here in Molly, our heartfelt thanks to you for your honest sharing of your work and your life. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Paul. It's really been a pleasure and a privilege.
Thank you.
So thank you for inviting me.
Thank you
and
very
I'm
much.
delighted to be part of it.
Thank you very much.
For me, literature, for me, writers, for me, the arts, in some ways, capture what's often missed in conversation, what's often missed historically when it comes to the lives of people who, for various reasons in this country and beyond, don't experience an equal world, a world that is accommodating, is embracing of diversity, and certainly a world that isn't inclusive. So I feel the arts and literature play a very, very central and important role in advocating for a more equal, a more just, a more diverse and inclusive society.
You've been listening to a podcast from RadioMoLI, which broadcasts from Molly, the Museum of Literature Ireland. If you've enjoyed this programme, do consider becoming a Molly member or giving membership to a friend. It's the best way to support the museum and its programming. Visit molly.ie/membership to find out more. Thank you for listening.